Hi, NJ4Z here, and welcome to my ham shack in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And today on From the Ham Shack, we'll be talking about something I call the pillars of amateur radio. About a year ago, our club, the York County Amateur Radio Society here in Rock Hill, South Carolina, decided to start a YouTube channel. Well, the purpose of the channel was to promote amateur radio and, of course, to promote our club. In the process of putting this together, we decided that we needed some branding to make all of our content look consistent. And we also wanted it to express what we thought amateur radio was and what our club was about. So I was tasked with putting together this little video or leader into all of our content. So in the creative process, I sat down, pencil and paper, and decided to put down on paper what I thought amateur radio was about. And I kept coming back to the same ideals and principles over and over again. These I call the pillars of amateur radio: art, science, technology, education, service, community, and legacy. Those are all principles or ideals that support this hobby. So I'm going to play the little intro piece so you can take a look at it, and then we'll talk about each of the individual ideals or pillars, as I call them, in detail and how they apply to the hobby.
Parks on the air calling CQ 20 meters.
The first pillar of amateur radio is art, and art can be defined in two ways that apply to our hobby. The first is the acquisition of a skill or skills through observation, study, or experience. The second is the application of a skill or human creativity to solve problems and create things. So when we look at amateur radio as an art, we can look at a couple different aspects. The first is amateur radio as a whole is a group of skills acquired over time through observation and study. We have to study to take our license test so that we understand what amateur radio is and what we can and can't do. We also learn things like Morse code, which is a new language. So it's an art of learning a new language. It's a skill. We also apply human creativity, constantly applying human creativity in this hobby, whether it's designing an antenna, designing a piece of equipment, building it, learning to solder. Those are all valuable skills that we learn through this hobby, and they all become art over time. And then you talk about something like propagation. Understanding propagation and how to use your skills to communicate with others all over the world using said propagation, that's definitely an art. You don't learn that overnight, and it's not an easy skill to acquire. So as you can see, amateur radio as a whole is an art, and we as amateur radio hobbyists and enthusiasts, we are artists. Closes the circle for us. And that's the first pillar of amateur radio, art. So let's move on to the second. The second pillar of amateur radio is science. And science can be defined as a set of tools or systematic methods for studying the world around us through experimentation and observation. When we look at amateur radio as a science, we see that the hobby becomes the tools and the world becomes the laboratory. Every time we turn on our radios, whether we're transmitting or receiving, we are studying the effects of electromagnetic wave propagation through the atmosphere. We study solar cycles, solar flaring, and CMEs to see how they affect radio propagation. In fact, in 2017, during the Great American Solar Eclipse, thousands of radio amateurs all over the country took part in an experiment to see the effects of a solar eclipse on radio propagation. We experiment with electronics and electrical circuits as we design and build homebrew equipment to enhance our stations. We study antenna theory to better design and build more efficient antennas that provide us better communication paths to achieve our goals. We experiment with computers and computer technology and networking to control our stations remotely and also to develop tools like Whisper, FT8, JS8 Call, and Arden to more efficiently transfer information via radio frequency. We explore atmospheric phenomenon like tropospheric ducting, E-skip, and auroral propagation. We observe weather phenomenon as trained weather spotters through the Skywarn program. We as amateurs build, design, and launch HAMSATs, which are small satellites equipped with amateur radio equipment that allow amateurs all over the world to experiment with satellite communications. With amateur radio, our ability to experiment, observe, and learn is unlimited. We have a very dynamic set of tools, and the world is our laboratory. And that's science by definition. The third pillar of amateur radio is technology, and it can be defined as advanced machines or software developed for a specific purpose. When you look at amateur radio as technology, you have to go back in history, further back than Marconi, who invented radio, to the days of people like Joe Maxwell, Nikola Tesla, Heinrich Hertz, and Faraday. They all made advancements in technology that helped Marconi develop radio. And then you push forward to E.L. Armstrong, who developed superheterodyne. And again, you move forward to Lee DeForest, who pioneered vacuum tubes and built vacuum tube radio sets. And then we jump forward again into the late 40s, and at Bell Labs, they developed transistors and the transistor radio sets. And then we move full circle to today with the most advanced transceivers we have, and that's software-defined radio. And that's actually a combination of hardware and software. Pioneers in that were Joe Minolta and Eric Blossom. Eric Blossom was at MIT, and he developed the open architecture software that's used now with SDRs or software-defined radios. Then you have folks like Joe Taylor, who developed WSJTX. Call sign is K1JT. I believe he's at MIT as well. And that is a specific software developed for encoding and decoding weak signal propagation in a digital mode. You have FLDigi was out there. It's an open architecture developed by many folks that help bring digital to the forefront in amateur radio. And you have logging software specifically built, N3FJP and N1MM, Ham Radio Deluxe. All of those software technologies were developed for a specific purpose, and that's amateur radio. So as you can see, amateur radio truly is technology, whether it be machine or software. So let's look at the fourth pillar of amateur radio, which is education. The fourth pillar of amateur radio is education. And education can be defined as the receiving or giving of a systematic instruction on a subject. When we look at amateur radio as an education, we can look at it from those two aspects, both the receiving and the giving. So let's look at receiving first. Amateur radio as a whole is an endless opportunity to educate oneself. We begin our educational journey in amateur radio by studying for our technician's license test. And then we proceed to the general, and eventually, if we find need, we move to amateur extra. So we're constantly getting a systematic instruction on the rules of regulation and also different aspects of the hobby through our licensing program. Then we also have something we call Elmering, and that's mentoring. And a lot of us, when we start out as new technicians or even new generals, we look to others in the hobby who have more experience than us to provide us education on different aspects of the hobby. So once again, we're receiving a systematic instruction from our colleagues in the hobby, on the hobby. Then we talk about the giving of systematic instruction on the subject of amateur radio. And we can look at that also through the mentoring or Elmering process. As we advance in the hobby and we learn different aspects, we pass that knowledge along to other amateurs. We work to bring new technicians up to general level and help them build their first stations and to help them develop antennas and operating skills. And even to the generals, we get them on HF radio and help them learn digital modes or CW as they move forward. So we're constantly either receiving or giving an education. And then there's an aspect of amateur radio which kind of gets downplayed a lot, but probably needs to be brought to the forefront if we want to advance the hobby. And that is engaging the youth. And we can do this in a couple different ways. The first is through the scouting programs. Most of the scouting programs have the radio merit badge. And we as amateur operators and enthusiasts should help the scouting programs encourage the youth to get those radio merit badges. And we can do that through educating ourselves on their syllabus for that, and then going out and teaching those classes and helping the scouting programs get them on the air. It's an education in amateur radio. The second part of that is what I find more important, I think, and that's encouraging educators, whether it's grade school, middle school, high school, or even in colleges. We look at amateur radio as a hobby and all the different aspects of amateur radio. What better subject to study when you want to concentrate on STEM or STEAM education? And when we say STEAM or STEM, if you're not familiar with the terms, STEAM is science, technology, engineering, math. And STEAM is science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And they're very similar in their education, but it's a concentration on those individual disciplines that help children get better educations and are better suited for the world of work that we have today. So amateur radio, I don't think there's a better hobby suited towards that purpose. When you think about it, how much science, technology, engineering, and math do we use in this hobby? Quite a bit. And this hobby educates us on all those subjects. And we've already talked about amateur radio as an art. So that encompasses STEAM. So we need to get out there as amateur radio enthusiasts and encourage educators and become educators ourselves to help the youth get into this hobby. Not only to help grow the hobby and preserve the hobby for future generations, but also to help with STEAM and STEM education. We can organize clubs within schools as well. That's always a valuable tool. It gives kids social interaction and it provides education. So as you can see, amateur radio is an education. The fifth pillar of amateur radio is service. And service can be defined as helping somebody or a system of supplying a public need. Now when I think of amateur radio as a service, the foremost thing in my mind is the fact that amateur radio as a hobby is the largest unfunded communications asset in the world. Think about that. Amateur radio operators all over the world form a communications asset that relies on no one else's infrastructure other than our own. We can communicate in all kinds of conditions without any infrastructure, whether it be the internet, wires, fiber optics. We don't need any of that. We just need our radio sets, a power source, it can be a battery, and the atmosphere to conduct our communications. Amateur radio operators worldwide volunteer to support local, state, provincial, national governments, and also the international community like the United Nations in times of disaster or need to provide secondary or even primary communications. We also volunteer with large non-governmental organizations such as the Red Cross or Salvation Army. You know, in the last few years I can think of many examples that amateur radio has come to the aid of local, state, and federal governments, and also non-governmental organizations. We look at things like California wildfires back that destroyed the city of Paradise a few years ago. Amateur radio operators volunteered their time to provide vital information on firefighting efforts, and also to provide communications and information to the general public on escape routes. Back in 2010, we had a massive earthquake in Haiti, which devastated that country, destroyed almost all of its infrastructure. And there was amateur radio operators volunteering to go to the country and provide communications. And the most recently in my mind that I can think of is Hurricanes Irma and Maria, when they devastated the Caribbean. Both the USVI, the British Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, and many other nations, island nations in the Caribbean, completely devastated. Some of the islands were scrubbed clean by Irma's 200-mile-an-hour winds. There were no communications available, but amateur radio stepped in once again. Through the ARRL and even just local hams, they provided many vital communications, and including air traffic control for flights coming in with supplies and relief. And then you think about programs like Skywarn, where amateur radio operators are trained spotters through the National Weather Service, and they go out and spot weather phenomenon and reportable criteria to the National Weather Service that helps them warn storms or helps with insurance claims, whether it be flooding rains, hail, high winds, tornadoes, or hurricane conditions, heavy snow. Amateur radio operators around the country go out and gather information and translate that information back to the National Weather Service. And they've saved many lives doing that. And finally, we give back to the community as a whole through donation of time and equipment to charitable organizations. Many times they do fundraisers through road races, rallies, and other events. And amateur radio operators are there to provide communications for those. A lot of times you're in areas where you don't have cell phone coverage. So amateur radio operators go out and volunteer and build a communication network for those events. So as you can see, amateur radio repays the community through offering a public service for communication. All unfunded, all volunteered. So amateur radio, it's a service. The sixth pillar of amateur radio is community. And community can be defined as a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common goals or interests. And I think community is one of the strongest pillars of amateur radio. When you look at amateur radio as a community, we see that we all have a common bond, the love and passion for wireless communications or radio. We all have a common starting point for a conversation or a friendship. When I joined this hobby about 4.5 years ago, my uncle, Victor Echo 2 Echo Kilo Hotel, who ushered me into this hobby, told me once that I would meet some of the finest people and some of the smartest people on the planet in this hobby. And I have to say, after 4 years, I agree with him. I have made lifelong friends that I would not have the opportunity to make if it were not for amateur radio and amateur radio community. I've also met some of the smartest people in this hobby. You know, as amateurs, we form clubs to provide social interaction, to share our ideas, to share our love of the hobby. And just the fact that we're on the radio, communicating with others all over the globe or in our backyards, provides social interaction. And as we look at the hobby, we all realize that more older people or elderly people are involved in the hobby than there are younger people. And a lot of these older people crave that social interaction. They need it. A lot of times their relatives and friends who they've grown up with or spent many years together have gone on. and those folks sometimes are alone in the world. And amateur radio provides them a social outlet, whether it's through the club or just a rag chew on the radio. It's a valuable tool or valuable asset to those folks. They need that social interaction, and the amateur radio provides that sense of community. And that community extends all over the world. We as amateur radio operators have an opportunity to communicate without anybody's infrastructure to anybody we choose throughout the world. We get to exchange ideas and share our communities with their communities. That's why I'd say it's one of the strongest pillars of amateur radio is community. Because we all share one common bond, and it draws us all together. It provides us a social interaction. It enriches our lives through the exchange of ideas. So as you can see, we have a strong amateur radio community. The seventh pillar of amateur radio is legacy. And legacy can be defined as one's contribution to the future or future generations. When we look at amateur radio as a legacy, we have to realize we stand on the shoulders of giants. People like James Maxwell, Heinrich Hertz, Nikola Tesla, Guillermo Marconi, J.A. Fleming, Lee DeForest, all who made important discoveries or developed technologies that brought amateur radio to life. We have other giants like Fred Schnell and Leon Delroy, who pioneered wireless transatlantic communications. Robert Moore, who pioneered single sideband. Folks like Joe Taylor, who developed software for weak signal encoding and decoding. Eric Blossom, who developed the algorithms in the open architecture for software-defined radio. Then we have folks like St. Maximilian Kolbe. And for those who don't know St. Maximilian Kolbe is, he was arrested by the Nazis for helping the Allies during World War II using amateur radio. He was interred at the Auschwitz prison camp and eventually was martyred when he stepped in for a condemned man. The legacy of amateur radio, when you think about it, all of these people have in one way or another changed the world. We have helped develop technologies that have saved lives and advanced the world in industries and communications. So that's the legacy of amateur radio. And as current operators and caretakers of this hobby, we need to honor that. We need to honor that legacy by bringing more people into this hobby, by educating the public on this hobby and what it can do and what it has done. That's the legacy of amateur radio. As you can see, this hobby has a large foundation of strong amateur operators from the past to the present. And we have strong pillars, principles, and ideals that support this hobby. There's one more I'd like to talk about that I don't know that's really a pillar of amateur radio, but it's adventure. When you think about amateur radio, it's an adventure. So maybe it's the eighth pillar. I'll leave that for you to decide. But when we look at amateur radio as an adventure, we share this common bond, and in that common bond, the social interaction provides opportunities for us to share fun and time with others, and also time with ourselves, time alone, to spend in our own heads and to educate ourselves. It's a journey, and adventure can be defined as an exciting journey. So I find that amateur radio, for me at least, it is an exciting journey. I have many stories to tell about events that went on during activations with friends and hanging out at the clubhouse and contacts that I've made. So Yeah, I guess you can call adventure is maybe the 8th pillar of amateur radio. So we look at it. Amateur radio is an art, it's a science, it's technology, it's a service, it's an education, it's a community, and it's legacy. And I guess an adventure. So there you have it. Those are the 7 pillars of amateur radio. And with that, I will say 73. Stay healthy and stay safe. And always be passionate about your radio. If you find value to what we're doing here, please subscribe and hit the notification bell.